Hi, everybody. Today I have the distinguished honor of having Dr. Taras Kuzio with me to discuss the Ukrainian-Russian war. And I just wanted to introduce him briefly. Dr. Kuzio is an expert on Ukrainian political, economic, and security affairs. In 2010, he predicted the Russian annexation of Crimea that would result from the ousting of President Yanukovych, and currently is an associate with the research and a research fellow at the Henry Jackson Society. There are two books that I found regarding this issue that you can find on Amazon. The links will be below.
The book on the right, The Crisis in Russian Studies, can be actually downloaded free of charge. So if your viewers go to the website of that publishing house, they can be downloaded free in PDF.
That's great. Okay.
In Russian Studies.
Yep. And let's dive right in. Could you describe the state of the war as you see it at this point in time?
Well, it's an interesting question because both most Western experts on the Russian military, on Russian sort of security affairs, had a similar view to Russian leaders in the Kremlin that this would be over very quickly. There are probably many reasons for that. A lot of them are in that book, Crisis in Russian Studies. I mean, I think a lot of Western academics who follow Russia tend to look at Ukraine through Moscow's eyes, as it were, and they have a kind of a feeling that they have a right to, or they have a knowledge base that they can talk about the entire former Soviet Union, not just Russia. It's a bit ludicrous because it's like somebody, for example, an academic in, say, Brazil or somewhere in Latin America, who thinks that they have a knowledge base to talk about the whole of Latin America and the whole of Central America. Of course, that's ridiculous. But so both groups, Kremlin and Western experts, had an opinion that Ukraine would fold within 2 days, that this mighty Russian army would defeat Ukraine and the capital city of Kiev would fall and President Zelensky would have to flee, or he would be killed. Obviously, none of that has happened. We're now over 3 weeks into the war, and the situation on the ground, at least, looks actually bad for Russia, not good for Russia. The only advantage Russia has is that it keeps firing rockets from Russian territory into Ukraine. It's already fired 1,000 of these rockets. Can you believe how many? 1,000. And these usually, I would say 90% of cases, target civilian facilities, so civilian buildings, infrastructure, utilities, and such like. Rarely do they hit military targets, sometimes, but not always. On the ground, Ukrainian troops are doing exceptionally well. They have their own locally produced military equipment. Ukraine was a major producer of military equipment in the Soviet Union. It had a large military industrial complex, so Ukraine continued that. And of course, Ukraine's been receiving some very good Western equipment, such as javelins and stingers, and NLAWs from Britain. And prior to the war, Ukraine had purchased Turkish drones, which showed, which have been proven to be very, very effective, unmanned drones. So all of that, and also because Ukrainian troops, I think, are more motivated, they're angry, they have fire in their belly, they operate more in smaller groups, and so they're more agile. They know the terrain, of course, they know their area, because you have troops and then you have territorial volunteer defense, and territorial volunteer defense, of course, they are defending their home area. Russian troops don't know the country. They sometimes often get lost. They can be easily ambushed because they travel in convoys on main roads. So that's relatively easy to do. Ukrainian troops don't have to do that. They will go through back lanes or fields and other ways. And Russian troops are not very motivated. They've been lied to by their officers, by their political leaders. They weren't really told what is the ultimate goal of all of this, what, to kick out drug addicts and Nazis, which is what Putin talked about. They find it a bit odd that they're never welcome, because they were told they were going to be welcomed as liberators. But in fact, when they've occupied a couple of towns in southern Ukraine, the people come on the streets and protest against their presence, call them occupiers, fascists, and other not pleasant names. And they don't have good supplies. So often when Ukrainians have captured these troops, they're very hungry. Some of the rations that they've been issued with are out of date, 7 years out of date. So that's a reflection just of the corruption in the Russian army. And it also affects morale that Russian officers and the Russian government doesn't care about collecting dead bodies. This is something that's very important for soldiers' morale, that if there's a wounded soldier or a dead soldier, that troops go in and try to bring that body back for an honorable burial. Not for the case of Russian soldiers, sadly. They're just left where they've been killed. Nobody from the Russian side cares about them at all. And we are talking a huge number of dead. In only 3 weeks of war, the American estimate, which is conservative, I think, is about 7,000 dead. The Ukrainian one is about 13,000 dead. So even if we take the middle of the two, about 10,000, that's a huge number in 3 weeks. To put that into perspective, that's 2/3 of what the Soviet Union lost in Afghanistan in the 1980s, over 8 years. The Soviet Union lost 15,000 soldiers in Afghanistan. 10,000 soldiers is more than the US lost in Iraq over 8 years, and more than the US lost in Afghanistan over 20 years. So this is a huge amount of casualties. And usually there's a proportional rate. For every dead soldier, there's at least 3 to 4 wounded. So we're talking about 30 to 40,000 wounded and dead. 10,000 dead, and then say 30,000 wounded. That's a huge number, considering the occupation force is about 150,000. So nearly a third of the occupation force has been somehow hindered, captured, wounded, killed, and such like. So I think that on the ground, the Ukraine is doing well, but the problem, the biggest unpleasantness of the war is just the destruction of property and the killing of civilians. And of course, that then leads to a massive refugee outflow. Something like 3 million refugees have left Ukraine. And some cities like the port city of Mariupol and Kharkiv in the northeast have been literally demolished. Mariupol is 80% destroyed. So the same kind of tactics that Russia was using, firstly in Chechnya, when Putin came to power 22 years ago, and then again in Syria, in cities such as Aleppo.
And Dr. Kuzio, could you get a little bit into the prognosis, or your prognosis of the potential outcomes of this war?
The prognosis at the moment, it looks like, on the one hand, Russia is being heavily pushed back, as it were, by the Ukrainian side. But on the other hand, Ukrainian forces do not have the strength to completely expel these Russian forces from Ukraine. So there's a bit of a stalemate going on here. And because of that, it's difficult to know to what degree where this is going to go. Can a normal Western army would not be able to sustain such high casualties, because it's not just deaths, it's also destruction of military equipment. If a Western army had lost 10,000 dead in 3 weeks, the government who had sent that would be overthrown. They would be kicked out. There'd be new elections. But of course, in Russia, you have a dictatorship. So we can't, it's a completely different ballgame. And Putin is a sociopath. He doesn't care about human life, whether it's Russian or non-Russian. So that won't have an effect on him, but where it will have an effect, but this takes time, is on the Russian public. Because many Russian families will not get their sons back. And Russian prisoners of war are encouraged to telephone home and talk to their parents, girlfriends, sisters, friends, and tell them the reality of what's taking place in Ukraine. So that information will seep back, and the information going back will also be filtered into Russia because of the huge number of people in the West who are hacking into Russia. There's a huge number of computer programmers who have volunteered to help in the hacking of Russian official websites and Russian television. This was spearheaded by the anonymous computer group, and then it's all been backed up by Ukrainians and foreigners. And they've had a lot of success in putting opposition petitions against the war and accusing Putin of being a war criminal on Russian television and on Russian websites. So that information will get back. Of course, we don't know how long this is going to take to percolate down and lead to protests. Let's not be also naive. Quite a lot of Russians support the war. They believe the propaganda that this is a war against NATO or to prevent Ukraine joining NATO. And some opinion polls show it can be something like 50-60% of Russians who support this. Now, of course, that's not true about young people, but young people aren't enough to, as it were, bring down the Russian government. So the prognosis is difficult to make. To what degree this war will continue, it could. I'm not really worried about the war on the ground because Ukrainian forces are doing quite well. But the big concern is the destruction of property, killing of civilians in this area. And hopefully the new weaponry coming in, which will be surface-to-air missiles and kind of anti-rocket missiles, will reduce that. Because there's a completely indiscriminate use of those Russian rockets. The West also has some other potential ways to influence Russia, including threats to bring criminal charges against the Russian leadership at the International Criminal Court. US, British, and other Western leaders have already talked about Vladimir Putin as a war criminal and compared him to the Serbian leader Slobodan Milosevic. So that's one area. And Russia's been kicked out of the Council of Europe and, of course, has very few friends even at the United Nations. Only 4 countries supported Russia at the United Nations. Russia's even isolated in its neighborhood of Eurasia. Only Belarus is backing Russia there. So it's difficult to give any complete prognosis because of the instability that everybody sees when Vladimir Putin makes a press conference. This is not a stable person. One wonders where's his white cat and why he's not stroking like a madman this white cat.
I think that the analysis is currently that there's, I mean, this whole idea of sanctioning the oligarchs seems to have kind of collapsed because the oligarchs do not seem to have any power over Putin, but the other way around. And the only circle that I think may have an impact on his long-term, on his longevity is his security circle of his loyalists, and that is a really big question whether they will do anything or not. But I don't know if you've heard the news, but they're now doing hacking in both directions, by the way. There's been hacking into the Ukrainian TV station with deep fake
I haven't
video
seen
of
it.
Zelensky
Oh, right, right. Okay. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
claiming that he was
Sure. Sure.
laying his weapons down.
Well, the Russian cyber attacks and Russian hacking have been going on for 8 years. The West has just ignored it. It's only now that the West is taking some interest in that. Yes, you're right that there is no honor amongst thieves, and he should be always watching his back. Um, I think one interesting factor is that there's quite a large, quite a high number of senior Russian officers getting killed. Um, there's only, I think, I read about 20 senior Russian officers in the invasion force, and something like 7 or 8 already dead. That's a huge number.
Yeah.
I suspect, I don't have any evidence, that some of the intelligence where Ukrainians could find these senior officers is given by the West, because the West is doing three things, or NATO, the Western governments. It's helping Ukraine to combat cyber warfare, it's providing intelligence on Russian military movements, and providing weaponry. So the West is heavily involved, whether it likes it or not. This is the 1980s supercharged.
Yep.
So those could be, but the difference between post-communist countries and Latin America, or even Southern Europe, is that in Latin America and Southern Europe, there's a tradition of military coups, of the military intervening, and in Turkey as well, of intervening in politics. And in the communist world, or the former communist world, that was never the case. The only example of the military intervening in a communist country was in Poland in 1980 when there was martial law introduced. So there isn't that tradition as much, but certainly Putin's paranoia is there, and you see that the way he organizes meetings, the ludicrous long table. He has his food always tested before he eats it. I mean, on and on and on. So he is certainly fearful, and about 3 or 4 officers have already been arrested, and because of course, as a narcissist dictator, he's not going to blame himself for the failure of the war. He's going to blame others, who probably were less inclined to agree to go in. This is Putin's obsession with Ukraine that has created this war, and I'm sure there are many people in the senior military and intelligence services in Russia who had personal objections because they knew this would not be an easy country to occupy.